Welcome to Bowlful of Energy, a new and dynamic webinar series that will showcase top experts as they discuss today's energy topics. I'm Scott Steiner, General Manager from Albireo Energy and your moderator for today's panel. We're happy to welcome our first guest on episode 1, and we will be discussing the new rules for energy for customers large and small. Thank you for joining us. Before we start, I'll give a quick rundown of how today will go. We'll start with a brief introduction of our panelists, and then we'll head into Q&A and invite our guests to take questions from the audience lastly. We'll try to keep our answers brief and on topic, and if time allows, we'll get a chance to elaborate and debate between us. Our panel today boasts 4 top experts from various sectors of the energy world, and we are proud to have the following on our inaugural episode. Sean Kelly has spent 16 years of his career in the electric industry, graduated from Texas A&M University. He currently serves as CEO and co-founder of Amperon company, and most recently added the most important thing to his resume, new dad. So congratulations, Sean.
Thank you.
Regina Durga, a sales leader from Centrica, spent over 15 years of her experience working with energy efficiency and the daily challenges of customers to optimize their energy usage and make renewable power a reality. Matt Holden has had a passion for energy efficiency throughout his professional life, and that led him to found SmartHeart Group. Its mission is to provide building consulting services with a focus on increasing efficiency. And John Hartnett is a VP of Energy Procurement at Albireo Energy and has spent over 20 years in the energy industry. John has a demonstrated history working with private and public companies and is highly skilled at complex commodity solutions. Welcome to everyone, and let's get started on the latest energy scoop. We'll start with Sean. Most customers listening to and watching this webinar use the deregulated markets for their energy buying. Can you speak a bit on the craziness of the past year, focusing maybe a little bit on what happened on Texas, about the 2020 shutdown, the eventual reopening, and what is in store for our post-COVID future?
I'm pretty sure I can go fill up the next hour with this question. It's definitely been an interesting year. Every time you think something like that never has happened before, like you're out of the woods, it happens again. And so I guess we started off with COVID. COVID, again, it's very difficult. What Amperon does is provide demand forecasting for retail energy providers. And so with this, we have a 15-day forecast, which goes hour by hour, and then also a 5-year forecast. So with this, it's very hard because in the machine learning models, we don't put regulatory, we don't put legislative. And so it's very difficult to go in and understand New York said this, or Texas said this, or we're back to work, or we're not. My wife's been furloughed for a year now. And so those things but yet Houston's still open. And so all those things are very, very difficult to model, but we're getting better and better at it with each and every model run. So it's something that's very difficult. I know just owning a broker previously, this is something that's going to be very, very hard. You do everything on the procurement side. I guess, John, this is what you're stuck with, is understanding what the HU is. And if your historical usage has just disappeared for March, April, and May, in a lot of the Northeast of 2020, then it's going to be very hard to forecast going forward. And that's really what Amperon's trying to step in and do by just bringing in top data science talent. So it's a year unlike any other. Everyone's obviously worried about making money. Everyone really took a pretty big P&L hit just in 2020. And then I guess we thought we were out of the woods, and then Texas happened. And so I live in Houston, and with this, we knew that it was coming. Our meteorologist was screaming that it was going to be bad. We did not know how bad it was going to be. Obviously, our forecast could not have called this. You can't really call 35% outages statewide. So that was definitely interesting. But thankfully, we were told our customers starting, I think, February 4th, to go buy and get long those days. So thankfully they were able to sell back into the market during these load shedding. So this event happened. The things that I personally think are unfair about it is that they arbitrarily put in a $9,000 price cap, which is a really big number considering people are used to a $20 or $30 per megawatt hour. And I didn't think that was fair. The ancillaries went absolutely through the roof. Texas is very different, being an energy only market as opposed to the East being capacity markets. So they have that, and then they also have this mythical number called UFE, unaccounted for energy. And that is normally a fraction of a percent, but it wound up being as high as 16% some hours. So it was just a complete just debacle. And again, something that's never happened. And we just keep having these events that have never happened, which I guess many people point to climate change. And it makes it very, very difficult on all of us trying to lock in long-term rates and help people forecast. So yeah, it's definitely I've been doing this since 2005, and it is the craziest year I've seen by far. And I hope that when I retire, I will still say this was the craziest year. This is not something I want to beat. So yeah, that's kind of the quick rundown of what's happened the last, 15 months. But hopefully we're out of the woods now.
So Sean, as a quick follow-up, would you suggest that this is a one-time event that we're behind, or has this exposed weaknesses in the market that need to structurally be corrected?
I think it's definitely exposed weaknesses in the market. I'm very for renewables, but if it's not handled properly and there's no base load, you can't count on wind and solar as an actual, it's intermittent generation. It's really inexpensive, but it's there when it wants to be there. And until batteries get to the magnitude of being able to say we have a 500 megawatt battery and that will replace a 500 megawatt natural gas plant, I think we're going to continue to have this problem. There's 32,000 megawatts of wind in Texas. When I started my career, I was scheduling actually Direct Energy 2 at Tenaska. It was their wind portfolio in 2005. And there's 2,800. So just in my career, I've seen wind go 12x, and it looks like solar's headed that path as well. And so with this, I mean, it's definitely great to have, but we definitely need to spend a lot of money, whether that's government money and or venture capital money and private equity money, but on energy storage. I think that's the real key to get us kind of over the hump here, because you just can't replace a 1,000 megawatt plant with 1,000 megawatts of wind. It's not an apples to apples comparison.
So John, talking energy trading and markets, it leads us a little bit into how pricing breaks down and the components that go into a price. And how would you advise customers, or how are you advising customers about the security of a fixed price, or letting some of those components float with these ever-changing markets?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and one that the challenge that we have is that state by state it differs, right? So to Sean's point, Texas has its own set of rules and regulations. New York has their own set of rules and regulations, New England, PJM. So when we look at the makeup of an energy price, in most markets, the actual volatile market liquidity of a market is around 40% energy. The ancillary costs, and back up there, when we started in the industry, that energy price was probably about 80% of your total fixed price. So over the years, the market has shifted to cheaper energy, but more expensive ancillaries. So when we look at the opportunity for customers to manage risk, we have to separate out the items that are sort of tariff-based and the items that are actually market-based. So talking through that, each state has a different renewable portfolio standard that the state has to meet, which means that a percentage of your price has to be green. And in that market, what we're looking at right now are the variations of how green is priced and the compliance that these suppliers like Centrica, Constellation, Calpine, Engie, they have to buy in this market. So where we've kind of set that target date or that target percentage of what that price is, the suppliers are forced to buy in that market. And I think for the most part, over the last 5 or 6 years, that price has been relatively flat and inexpensive. Over the last 6 weeks, that price has gone up about 120%. So the offshoot of that Texas market, we saw a real increase to the cost of Green certified RECs. And right now, when you look at small customers and large customers, the small customers want to be green. They have an ability to be green. The large companies are forced to be green and want to be from a compliance standpoint because they're reporting nationally and globally. So what we're doing is really trying to understand that price, understand what parts of that price that customers can affect, and what parts of that price they have to just go out and simply buy at market. So I think what you'll hear from the other panelists today is that as we get into that energy efficiency, as we get into that energy conservation and the work that we're doing on auditing, those are things that customers can do that actually can lower their price for capacity and demand tags that come in, reducing their usage of what they have to buy. And as that price comes down from those things that they can affect, they overall can mitigate the overall risk of a price on a fully bundled rate.
So as a follow-up to that, when you talk to customers nowadays as they live through polar vortex and shutdowns and economy reopenings, are you seeing more people willing to take risk off the table and go with fixed prices, or given the rise, are people more willing to risk it going forward, that it's going to reset and come back down?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two ways. I think if you are a small and medium business, you are very budget centric, and your cash flow month to month is very important. So it's less about market timing and less about ensuring that the lowest rate on the table is taken. It's that you want the best contract and the best fixed budget that you can achieve, so you can go back to running your overall day-to-day business. So I think from a risk standpoint, they're more budget focused. On the larger end customers, they're really looking at this and making sure that the diligence is there, that when you're looking at a rate that's 9.8 cents versus 9.5, that they're equal and they can be compared. So they have to be able to justify their decision for writing a 2 or a 3 year contract. So you need 6, 7 quotes. There's a process they have to go through to that. And that risk, we half joke that you're always right until you're wrong. And in that marketplace, we see the polar vortex. So we know what New England's risk factors are. We now know what Texas's, risk factors are. But overall, I think the larger customers are more willing to take on some risk, look for future buying opportunities, and they want to adhere to a more rigid process that is time over time repeated, so that we can remove the variables and the guesswork from why we're buying, to saying we're going to be 80% hedged by Labor Day of every year, and we're going to kind of go through that process day in and day out. And over time, we will statistically win in understanding why we're in the pricing contract that we're in.
Regina, in many respects, energy procurement has become a lot more confusing because of the legislation around renewables and trying to be compliant with the grid mix and personal sustainability goals. Where are the opportunities as this market transitions for customers to not only be compliant, but also to drive lower cost to the bottom line?
I work out of the Northeast, so one of the things that makes this area very dynamic is that we have a lot of different states and the rules are different everywhere. So when you talk about compliance, it's kind of what John was talking to. It's different in every state. So it's important to work with customers to really understand what the opportunities are to save costs, and then to meet sustainability goals. There are great opportunities out there for renewables, and you talk about compliance. It's also about saving money, going green, really meeting sustainability goals. And there's the way the incentives are structured in certain areas that's very, very attractive. So not only can it be, hey, we have a mandate to go to be sustainable and to go green, it can actually really dramatically reduce their overall cost of energy. We're seeing right now in New Jersey that we're able to offer power purchase rates that are significantly lower than their current rate of energy. So we've gone, they're less than 3 cents, 2 cents less, and in a power purchase rate, and it's fixed for 15 years. So when you talk about risk, if you can do that and you have the right, the right setup, essentially the right roof, the right size, you're in a great position to capitalize on the current incentive structures that are going on in New Jersey that, and really drive cost reductions into your overall energy procurement, and also be able to have that sustainable message come across. Every state is different. So we see, projects in Connecticut, projects in Rhode Island, projects in Massachusetts. Pennsylvania, we're waiting for legislation to come that could change the game there. So John's smiling because I think he knows all very well what I'm talking about. It's so much driven by the incentives in the Northeast that it really depends on where you are, and even getting down into the region of where you are within. For example, in downstate New York, solar can be incredibly attractive and can be a great opportunity for customers. Whereas if you're in another area of New York, it may not work as well. So that's what we work with all day long is putting out those initial proposals and getting a sense on whether or not we can help a customer save money and going in this direction. And that's really it. I hate to say it's such a broad answer, but it depends on where you're located and what we can do, and trying to get the right situation, right solution that's going to work. And it's a great way to go.
So when you see a lot of these markets have to start off with government subsidies and tax incentives, have we gotten to the point that renewables can stand alone? Is there economies of scale now that it is a good business decision without those incentives, or are incentives still necessary in most cases?
In the Northeast, I don't think solar will not stand alone. We just don't have enough sun. California, it doesn't have the same incentive structures that we do for solar. They have enough sun in most areas, unless you get up into the San Francisco area. We're doing projects in Texas right now that do not offer the same incentives that are offered within the Northeast. I would say that currently everything that we're doing in the Northeast for solar is basically driven by incentives. That being said, I would say that also there's a great opportunity to address it. The best kilowatt hour is the one not used. So there's also a great opportunity to really go green, address your sustainability needs by reducing your usage and getting in there and really identifying and finding the energy efficiency that can be done in the building is a great opportunity no matter where you are. If you have the right, energy is expensive unless you're in some, up in near Niagara Falls, you're pulling hydro off and you get really cheap energy. But no matter where you are, we find those projects really work for people, and we do a lot of work with very large, everything from universities to very large manufacturing customers to help them reduce their overall usage and help save costs and go green.
Matt, we got a glimpse a little bit into pricing future and renewables future and how markets are going to be shifting, but a lot of customers have requirements that are here today with energy reporting and benchmarking compliance. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in the marketplace and how customers are required to report on their energy usage and what mandates they're being put under to reduce their carbon footprint?
Sure. Well, benchmarking is here to stay, and Alberio offers pretty easy benchmarking through their platform of tracking utility use. So it's a good thing to do from a business standpoint to know where you are with your energy use for your building year over year, month to month. But at localities, many cities are driving toward benchmarking, and benchmarking is just a way of measuring your consumption. And it's honestly not unlike, your W-2 form. As soon as you start reporting your income, it gets taxed. And so cities, they're going to start rolling out benchmarking, soon to be followed by requirements to keep reducing down their energy use, greenhouse gas emissions. New York City is kind of the leader in this, with a whole level of local laws that drive energy efficiency in the city. Boston has that. Washington, D.C. Benchmarking is, many cities across the country. Des Moines, Seattle, everywhere it's coming. So benchmarking is good from a business standpoint, just to know what's going on with your building. Benchmarking is also the first step toward regulation. And so we're seeing the trials and tribulations of bringing that regulation, some missteps, where laws get pushed out a couple of years because of compliance issues or just challenges around having enough city personnel to properly administer the programs. So there's a lot of issues around benchmarking. And in the end, kind of one of the most effective things is I'm going home at the end of the day, and the apartment building I walk into in New York City has a big letter D on the front door. And, what's that make me feel about going home? And it's not unlike going out to the restaurant and the sanitation score. Am I going to go to the restaurant with a score of A, or am I going to go to the restaurant with a score of D? It's going to drive behavior in the market. And that's kind of the first, hey, it's here to stay. It's going to start driving compliance issues. And they're just going to get more and more stringent over time. Around compliance, we kind of see two paths. It's like, what's the cheapest cost of compliance? And, for a while we saw that in Boston, where you could buy very inexpensive SRECs and not have to do much. That patch has been fixed. And so Boston, actually, we feel like Boston has a pretty good program around, hey, every 5 years, you got to reduce your energy use by 15% or conduct an ASHRAE level 2 energy audit that kind of gives you the roadmap of technical and financial information to make good choices about what to do with your building. So again, we see compliance around, hey, what can I do that's inexpensive for my building, or trying to get some really good technical financial information to drive some decisions to move forward. And then finally, let's just use the New York City carbon tax, 2024 pending carbon tax that's coming out. What we would suggest to owners is just kind of put some bookends on what's the potential impact. What's my current energy use? What's the potential impact of the current carbon tax? Who knows? It might be pushed out from 2024 to a year or two from that. Maybe the tax rate will be actually reduced per pound of carbon that your building uses. But bookend the issue, and then use the time between now and when these compliances come into effect to, hey, do the simple projects, the LED lighting, some simple controls on my boiler, and just like step by step reduce my energy use and keep checking back, with my benchmark data to see where I'm at, compared to the to that bookend report. And that's really kind of what we see in the market right now is the regulation is here to stay. Benchmarking is here to stay. It's a good tool. It's a good business tool for owners. Cities are going to use that to drive green initiatives. Initially, owners, there's going to be some loopholes or easy outs as far as compliance, or you can take the deeper dive. And then finally, just start looking at what's the best way to get around compliance and my exposure to these energy efficiency goals. And I guess finally, use the utility incentives out there and be smart about them. Examples are in 2019, Con Ed in New York City offered a lot of incentives around steam heat programs. So we drove a lot of customers into the steam heat program, which is actually going to become those energy efficiency measures that were paid for by Con Ed are now going to be mandated. This year we're doing building controls. There's lots of good incentives for building controls. A couple of years from now, that's going to be mandated. So just be smart about watching what's going on with the utility incentives and the state incentives, because like other people talked about, everyone's driving toward renewable energy, green, the states are kind of competing with each other. There's this head-to-head competition between Massachusetts and California. Who's going to be the greenest state? New Jersey is now has a huge initiative to become more green, and so we're really seeing the impact, and that kind of goes back to what John talked about, like, all the other costs in your utility bill that aren't really energy. Big chunk of that's going to be, all these energy efficiency programs, these greening programs. So I think that gives a good overall.
Great. This question's for the whole panel. There's a lot to think about. for customers in their daily energy management. And what we talked about so far really addresses more of the buying side and the compliance side, but customers think all day long about the how you use it side. And we'll open this up to everybody and want to hear from everybody on this topic. You work with customers all day long, so how well informed, how well equipped do you hear customers are when it comes to being able to address everything that gets thrown to them in the energy management? And how informed they are about what's coming up for new legislation and new requirements that's going to affect their properties or their buildings. Regina, do you want to start?
I think it depends on, on the customer to some degree, but there's a lot going on. I think just hearing from the different panelists, you get that. So Matt was touching on all the utility incentives and how some of them may expire, and to try and get in on that. And, there's demand response, and there's, solar or renewables, there's different, battery storage now, and what can they really take advantage of? So I think that's where partnerships are really important, and Alberio plays a big role in that. And this is what we do. And when we're dealing with customers, is helping to demystify it a little bit, but also just break it down to here's what makes sense financially for you. It's such a big piece, and they don't know, and understandably that how it's complicated, it's confusing. So that's really where I see where we can come in and help. And you have some customers that are definitely more sophisticated. If you're a Walmart, you're very sophisticated, and you have a whole entire team that's set up to do that. And they have a full sustainability strategy. If you're not that, if you're not Walmart, which most of our customers are not, it becomes a lot more challenging. So working with them to really understand their facilities, to understand how they're using the power that they have coming into the building, and then addressing and seeing where their challenges are, and really working with them on those things, and getting to the point where you say, okay, these are the things that we can do, and this is what makes sense financially. Let's address the efficiency in your building. You have an upgraded LED lighting. There's a controls opportunity, whatever that is on the inside of the walls. And then what can we do to, bring renewables and then layer that on top? That's where I think you can really start making true impact for a customer. And then they can go and buy the additional RECs that they need if they are still not getting that full offset that they on site. And that's where I really see the power of those partnerships coming in, and really demystifying it from the how you're using it in the building, bringing in renewables if it makes sense, to the supply to say, hey, let's work with Alberio. How are we then backfilling everything else that you need, and bringing you to meet your goals. And those goals, and that's the other thing I'll say, is those goals are very different customer by customer. So where one customer may have a huge desire to go green, another customer is just purely concerned about cost, and another customer is more concerned about deferred maintenance. So it's really about meeting them where they are to drive their agenda, and taking our expertise to the table to do that. That's what we're here for.
You talked a little bit about the bifurcation of ancillary charges and generation on the supply bill, but how many customers are thinking about the utility side of the bill and the delivery charges, and how that rounds into a total utility budget?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I always told myself just when I was doing consulting is that running a business is hard, and this is not their business. I mean, these rules change every day. I honestly have already learned something through this webinar, because I don't read all of this every single day. I love what New York did with Local Law 97. You have to force people to do this. My biggest client was in New York, and they had 30 grocery stores. Grocery is a very hard business. It is a 1% to 2% profit margin business. I always told myself they need to be running their business. Let me do my thing. And so it was great because they trusted me wholly to go in and say, hey, this is what we need. This is the clear value prop. This is why you need LED. This is the payback period. Just make it as simple as possible. And that's why I think it's on especially the good brokers, consultants out there to go and do this for people. My biggest problem, honestly, was bad actors. That's the only pushback I ever got from client, is because they had been scammed in some way, and they said, I'm just going to stick with Con Edison because Con Edison's not going to screw me over. But so-and-so did, and this was the biggest issue. And so that's one of the things that I just really took to heart. We managed some hospitals. We managed, again, grocery stores, property management companies. They need help. Literally, these laws change every single day. And so that's why us being the professionals here are the ones who need to go in and really help the building owner, because again, it's not their job. Their job is to keep their tenants happy. Their job is to manufacture XYZ. It's not electricity. That's my job now at Amperon. And so that's what we're doing. And one of the new products that we're offering is actually all the CP alerts. And so we're going out and letting the consultants know, we're letting the suppliers know. The biggest thing is, and it's been touched on before, is that, your energy bill it was 40% or it was 80%. Now it's 40%. And so we're offering these CP alerts. So, and even those are super confusing, and those are state by state. You have NSPL. Well, NSPL changes on a state by state basis. Luckily, I have really good people reading tariffs to know that our models are doing the right thing. PLC. We put together a PLC model. Hey, just call the 5 days out of 365. No problem. Just figure those 5 out. And so that's very difficult. The 4CP in Texas, the ICAP, all of these charges, these are growing of importance. Building owners have no idea. And so that's really the consultant's job to go out there and say, hey, by the way, this is the layup. This is how we get you lower. This is how we lower your capacity charge. What's capacity? I guarantee you most building owners, most property managers aren't really sure, or just now kind of have a fuzzy understanding of what it is. And so that's why we're doing the alerts. I'm not speaking to the end customers, but we have over 1 million meters. And so with these 1 million meters, it's across a whole bunch of REPs. So my goal is to go and teach these REPs, show them, and the job is to customer engage. And so I want to give them the best information possible to go do that. And so that's why we're going out and putting out peak alerts, just again, because that is so much of the bill now. That's so much of the transmission. That's so much of the ancillaries. And I definitely like, Regina, what you said about electricity is expensive. I always say electricity is not expensive. It's expensive at the wrong time. It just happens that there's so much of the wrong time, because if the wind in Texas is going crazy, it goes negative. So, I mean, electricity is not.
You have to take it from a person who lives in Massachusetts. I'll tell you that Massachusetts.
So, in Texas, we're always at 2 cents unless we're at $9 per kilowatt hour. So, that's just, but electricity on the energy only standpoint it's not that bad. But again, if you don't manage your peaks correctly, and again, you got to realize all the customers that Alberio has, they're not energy companies. I doubt that NRG called Alberio and says, hey, can you please manage our buildings for us? This would be great. We need all the help we can get. But they're getting called from universities who are like, okay, these kids are remote learning. Oh, by the way, I got to keep the lights on. Can you please help with that? So that's what I think is so important. And Matt, you touched on a ton of great things. Like I love the legislation standpoint, because the building owners aren't going to do anything they didn't have to. They're trying to save as much money as possible. And now with like the local law 97s, it's really pushing the envelope, because I mean, our goals as a country are completely impossible unless the building owners do what they need to do.
Yep. And I think what I hear for a common thing is just building partnerships with owners. And we're all about trying to, if there are owners who have energy managers in-house, there are owners who don't have energy managers in-house. And, it's just basically, hey, I'm here to help, train and educate your staff as much as you want, and that helps build trust also. That hey, I'm willing to share anything and everything, as far as, how we come up with these savings, how, that's what I think is really key around this market, because you touched on it. Everyone gets, touched by a 1 or 2 bad actors, and that's really a challenge. Like some of the, the local law retro commissioning thing in New York City. I mean, hey, the real cost of doing a retro commissioning a building is, $15,000, $20,000. There are people out there who will do it for $3,000. I can't, that's not my market, and if that's your path to compliance, that's fine. I'm not going to do that. But that's one way of just, someone looks at me and says, here's your proposal and here's Larry's proposal. And I say, well, hey, if that's the path you want to go down, that's great.
John, you work with a lot of, I call them large commercial players, certainly in urban environments. I don't think any class of customers has been as wildly affected as they have during the pandemic and the reopening. What are you hearing from them about what their plans are and how they're preparing for tenants to come back, and how do they look at utility or energy management in spite of the great variability in what customers are doing within their buildings?
Yeah, no, I think, just to comment on what everyone said and answer the question, I think if you go back to like where deregulation started, right? It was to spur private investment into this public market to create new technologies and create transitions and create all of these different components to a marketplace. If you compare it to like when telecom deregulated, it took 25 years for the cell phone to come out in that process, right? So like we're just in our infancy of where we're going next. And I think what you heard everyone talk about is all these different things that are happening. There's so many options, and energy is now moved from that facility manager up into that executive suite, whether it be under ESG or a COO role. So I think when you look at those real estate buildings and you look at that component of the market, what COVID did was it take all the bad part of COVID aside, but what it did is allowed those building owners to make improvements into indoor air quality, into the sensors around that, into being able to go into a building and do various capital projects that might not have been available to them when the building was 90% occupied. And I think whether it be restructuring floor layouts or restructuring sensors and technologies, those private investments that were created 10, 15 years ago are now, failed and repositioned and retooled and now coming to market with a real opportunity to impact and monitor and really educate customers in a very simplistic way that they can understand how to implement it, how to be compliant, how to actually report on it, and actually give guidance to where they're going. Because before, the catchphrase of 30% by 2030 was great, but no one knew what 30% of what. So I think those baselines have been created, those benchmarks have been created, the consultants have been hired, the engineering firms have been engaged, and I think people have a real long-term view to how to fix this so that it's not, hey, how do we do this by December? It's how do we get there by 2030 or how do we get there by 2025? Let's come up with a strategic plan and work through that plan and make sure that we're allocating the right cost to this. And I do joke with this that, energy is probably the third largest line item that a customer has to buy behind taxes and labor. People have HR and people have accountants. Now that chief energy officer is critical to that organization to manage that line item. And so I think in times like COVID and where costs and expenses are critically reviewed, energy is being looked at now as a proactive way to be competitive in a market. And whether it be Regina, Matt, Sean, myself, we're engaging in different levels, which is really challenging, but overall kind of making sure that we're cohesive in our offering. Customers are going to benefit and the grid's going to benefit.
So Matt, when John talks a bit about these milestones that are out there, most of them were generated by government. Most of them were generated by legislatures. How prepared do you see the customers are to make these deadlines? How much are they getting started now to eventually get to those carbon net neutral goals that a lot of these major cities have?
Generally, I think people are pretty far ways away. There's a lot of, because there's confusion around all the different topics we talked about today. It's really hard for people to get their head around getting to carbon neutral getting to, the new benchmark standards, I think it's going to be a challenge. I think the opportunity is there around benchmarking to just have a little better transparency around what's going on in my building. I think if there's maybe one takeaway today is, hey, benchmarking really helps you get a grade from, 1 to 100. How is my building compared to comparable buildings? That's really good information. And that's becoming a more and more refined model of, comparing your building to comparable buildings as more and more benchmark requirements come out, because there's more building, there's more in the data set. So it just becomes a lot more accurate. So it's that I see as a good trend. What to do after I realize that I have a building with a score of 4, way down at the low end, what do I do? Well, one, I hope I'm buying my utilities as cheaply as possible, because I'm buying a lot of them, and then secondly, I need to come up with a long-term plan with, Regina or myself or some other firm to how can I just pick away at, taking my grade of 4 up, up, up.
One thing, Matt, I would love to comment on that is that I find a lot of times I grab a grade of 4 and then they get stopped, right? And then it's how do we pay for it? And how do we actually get this done? And so that's where I find a lot of times customers are just halted in their tracks, and they getting that to that point about John you made about the C-suite being involved in those decisions. I think that's so important to recognize and get them engaged and look at alternative ways to pay for upgrades and using savings, using using that avenue as a path to getting those upgrades done. And that's what I also am seeing a lot more of, even with Fortune 500 companies, but particularly where you're getting into hospitals, nonprofits, places like that, and using guaranteed energy savings to pay for those upgrades over time becomes a vehicle to allow them to meet those kind of mandates, which on their own, it's really hard to do. It's hard to pick away at it and to constantly having to put money into capital budgets to do that. And that becomes, I think, a bigger challenge than anything else. So getting the C-suite involved, getting your CFO involved, and helping to drive a different path can be a great way to get them there. And that's something that we're seeing more and more of.
And Sean, I'd like to ask you the last question before we get to some audience questions, but whether you're buying a stock or whether you're locking into a mortgage or you're buying energy, it's really about managing risk and whether or not you believe that investment's going up or going down. How do you see customers willing to accept risk in this post-COVID environment versus maybe before when things were a lot different?
Yeah, I think everyone's, that's a really good question. I think everyone's probably more risk averse. I think everyone kind of took their shots over the last year. A lot of people have lost a lot of money, especially these building owners, especially people with brick and mortar. So I think they want to de-risk, but they also don't want to lock in the highs. And so I think that's what everyone's very concerned about. I also wish that these goals set by states and cities and even the country as a whole were actually set by anyone on this panel, as opposed to people who don't know anything about energy. But I'm just old-fashioned from that standpoint, I guess, that energy people should make energy decisions. But I think that people are trying to take risk off the table, and people are going to try to do what is mandated of them. But again, at the kind of the lowest cost. Again, like Matt, going back to what you said, like if someone's trying to do it for $3,000 and you're trying to do it for $15,000, you're going to do it better. So now your job is to show them how much value add you actually are, which is something that I have a hard time just showing. This is the exact value of a number of like how much better our software is than said competitors. So I think that people are looking for less risk, but again, they don't always want to lock in the highs. So it's a very hard time. There's a lot of people that suffered through all this. And again, the people, especially that we're speaking to on the actual C&I side, that's the hardest. I mean, again, you're looking at, I've stayed in multiple hotels and it's like 10, 15% occupancy. And you're like, this is not what this was built for. This is not what you expected. But I am very bullish on this going forward. Because the thing I do tell myself is that if you're at an office And a lot of offices, like what we're going to do is probably have a mandatory Monday and then like one other day per week. And so if one person's at the office, our electricity consumption is going to be roughly the same as it is if everyone's at the office. And so that's something that I always look at. If you're in a clothing store and there's only 4 people shopping, do they turn off the lights in the areas you're not shopping in? If there's 100 people there normally, no, not at all. And so this electricity expense is going to become more and more. So I am very bullish on what is going to come from the markets, from all of that. But again, if it's not handled correctly, like we saw in February in Texas, then prices are going to be worse and worse. And so I personally recommend people to just lock it in now, de-risk themselves as much as possible, have a longer contract. I mean, those 15-year solar agreements, like those are amazing. I know it takes a longer term business to be able to do that. But I love the community solar play that people are doing now. I think that what we need to do is, again, this is very much the telecom industry. Like we're just now like understanding what's happening, and we still don't even understand it. I mean, if we're telling people that it's going to be in 2035, we're only selling electric vehicles. Goodness gracious, I can't even fathom like the Exxons being now EV stations. Like that just doesn't compute. And so, I mean, a lot is changing. And so I suggest people just kind of like lock it in now. I think things are just on the way up in terms of, in terms of price for a short time standpoint. But I definitely also think price certainty, budget certainty, again, makes sense for the small businesses out there. The larger businesses can take more risk, but they also can have a dedicated energy manager. I had a really interesting customer come the other day, and he is actually an energy manager for a data center, and they're going to basically use that as demand response. And so they're going to be mining currents, like cryptocurrencies, but then whenever they can shut down, then they're going to back down and just pump it all to the market. And so I think that's really interesting. That's what we need. That's what you need more and more players to be able to do going forward. So it's going to be interesting, though. The markets are interesting. I love markets. When you have a risk platform like we do at Ampere, its volatility is good. But again, there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, and volatility is good. Blacking out the grid is not good. So we've definitely got to put the proper precautions in place, because that's the most important thing. We definitely need to hit renewables targets, but we need to keep the lights on first and foremost.
Well, thanks, Sean. And thanks to all the panelists for all your thoughts and insights. And as we can see, this is an ever-changing market. So the conversation will adapt with changing conditions. And we want to spend the rest of our remaining time taking a couple questions that came in from audience members. And the first one will go to John. With the Biden administration, what does that mean for energy pricing going forward? Is it time to lock up?
Yeah, I think, the political side of this, and, where this administration, is that they've set some aggressive targets, and I think we have clear line of sight to the group that has kind of been put together to monitor sustainability and where they want to be from the benchmark and compliance. And if we draw that out another 3 years, I think states are going to follow suit there. So I think from a sort of political regulatory environment, I think people have clear line of sight that these changes are here. These compliance standards are here. State benchmarking is relatively falling in line, and there's a lot of questions to it. So I think overall, we're going to transition the grid, and there's going to be incentives for EVs and more energy efficiency products. So where and how those questions get answered, I mean, that's the biggest part, but I think we have at least a roadmap on a short-term level for the next 3 to 4 years that these policies are going to be put in place and mandated and forced to work for businesses. So I think it's engaging the right groups, the right vendor partners, and making sure that they understand the opportunities that are associated with the standards that are needed.
Great. And thanks to Mike from DC for this question. I was recently informed that I need to report my energy usage to the city. What does the city do with that? Matt, could you handle that one?
Sure. They publish reports that compare, your energy use to other comparable energy, other buildings. Again, going back to that example of the apartment building that I walk home to, and it's got a big D on the front door. So they're looking at that, and like most cities, Boston, New York, they have a list of like all the properties that are due to be benchmarked this year or hit the 5-year compliance mark for 15% energy savings. And they're getting better and better at, following up and making sure that you actually do what they say. So I guess directly expect eventually you're going to get a report card out of that benchmark data. And then following that, probably going to be some sort of mandate to keep ratcheting down your energy efficiency. And third, it's going to drive consumer choice. Again, getting back to that idea of like, the restaurant with a sanitation grade of A or D, where am I going to go?
Great. Regina, could you handle this one? Question is, I've been working with solar companies on either rooftop installations or maybe an off-site solution. What is coming with new solar products and should I wait?
New solar products, as far as, I don't see any new solar products necessarily around the corner as far as panels. Panels are more efficient than they've been, so maybe there's more efficiency gain that you can get into the future. But as far as a new product, I don't think it's worth waiting for. The decision should be made on what do the economics look like for you now. Do you have a site that will support solar and make it attractive financially for you? And if that is the case, then now is a good time to move. Legislation is ever changing. We have our pulse on it. We are constantly trying to stay ahead of it. It's just the same as what everyone else has been saying in every market. But if you have a project because of changing legislation, if you have a project that works for you now financially, you should pull the trigger and move forward.
Great. We have a question from Jane from Texas, and Sean, maybe you can handle this one. I had a fully fixed price and a reasonable electric bill during the polar vortex, but I know neighboring businesses that have been hammered. What happened in Texas, and can it happen again?
Yeah, it absolutely can happen again. It was one of the things is it was cold, but it wasn't that cold. I lived in Chicago for the polar vortex. That was cold. It was 12 degrees Fahrenheit here. I definitely walked to work with not a great trade on at minus 42 degree Fahrenheit, feels like. So, I mean, I just think the big thing in Texas that needs to be done is just the winterization, and also just kind of holding the gas pipelines accountable. I think that was kind of the biggest culprit. They were selling gas for $800 to $1,200 an MMBTU. Gas in Texas is almost free. They're like flailing it off in West Texas. So I think just winterization is the big issue that needs to be dealt with. And there's a billion laws going in and out of the Texas state legislature right now. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But it absolutely can again. Again, we're heavily not reliable on wind. I'm very, very big fan of wind being in the bid stack. I do not think that it should be part of like the said capacity of anything because it can go to zero. Same with solar, it can go to zero. And then plants, plants can technically go to zero too. We found out if they're not properly winterized or connected to gas pipelines. So I think understanding who's actually going to show up is very helpful. And again, in Texas, you absolutely need to be on a fixed price. Griddy was a very kind of ahead of their time company that is no longer because, again, they were letting people bear market price. But when you've got a price cap of $9,000 per megawatt hour compared to which is like 5 to 10 times the usual, you need to know what you're getting into. You don't need to go out there and blindly trade it. And I know a bunch of energy professionals who got smoked on this trade of trying to use their just let it go time of use per se. And so, I mean, it can absolutely happen again, but again, in Texas, we're very fortunate to have such a low price, low cost of energy, except for those times that you need to pass the risk onto the suppliers to let them hedge. They're going to make a little bit of money off you most of the year, but when these events happen, you need to let the experts take on the risk. And these are a lot of my clients to go in and say, hey, we're properly hedged for this. We have the event. We have this weather forecast that we put out a weather forecast daily from our meteorologist. So, I mean, in Texas, get a fixed price, and yes, it can happen again, but we'll see what the legislation merits. Because again, these plants, whether it be renewables or whether it be base load, they need to actually be winterized because again, our Texas winters aren't that cold. It's very, very nice most of the winter as opposed to living in Chicago.
Great. We'll ask our own John on the panel to answer a question from John from Boston. I have a restaurant in the city and little time to worry about being an energy manager. How do I lower my costs?
Well, I'm not going to give you my phone number, but I think the right way to do it is, there's published lists of consultants to work with, find one that you trust, but from Alberio Energy standpoint, find a person that represents you in the market, advise them on getting quotes and competitive quotes, and then listen to their market diligence or the market reports you have, and trust that they have your best interests at heart. Looking at fixed price deals, as Sean said, is right now a very opportunistic time. They'll not only achieve budget savings, but they'll create future savings as this market kind of looks to increase in 2022, 23, and 24.
Great. I'd like to take a moment just to thank everybody for being on our first episode of Bowl Full of Energy. It was a great conversation. I think a lot of great answers in there that will spark some conversation within customers and people watching this webinar. I think we also have some great topics for episode 2, and this was a great start to it. It's been a pleasure having each one of you here, and please stay tuned and watch our next Bowl Full of Energy. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.